The sing-song kind of reading that I'm used to in Italy, I've been thinking I really must give them some lessons, and maybe you could come and give them for me. The subject of intellect versus heart is a very, very important one. It's been discovered fascinatingly, but everybody who knows anything must have known it long ago, that the heart also has its own kind of understanding. In fact, they've found that it even there's a certain amount of gray matter in the heart, but the ability of the heart to understand is vital to true understanding. And Western culture has been almost entirely one-sided in the direction of the intellect. I remember when I was a young man, I was sort of, I attended philosophy class. I can't say I studied philosophy. I thought about it a great deal, but I didn't like the way they wrote it. It was all so intellectual and so long-winded, and I used to bring poetry books to class and figured I was getting more philosophy that way. But one of my pet difficulties, I won't go so far as to call it peeves, was Plato. Now, everybody knows that Plato was a great philosopher. Socrates was a great philosopher. The stuff is good stuff. Okay. I hated it. Why did I hate it? Well, basically only this, that I simply could not accept that if you try to arrive at a conclusion by reason alone, that you will achieve a universal truth. They would, Socrates would ask a question, and somebody would answer. Then he'd ask another, and somebody else, the answer would come. And another question. I felt that just is not the way to arrive at truth. You can answer a question, okay, but by the time you've come to the third or fourth question based on that first answer, you may well find yourself now saying, now, wait a minute. I don't know that I gave that first answer the way I really meant to. Give me an example. And Socrates had the idea that if you go by reason, he did have this truth. And of course, he was a wise man. He may have been a master for all I know. But he had this truth that there is goodness in all men. There is the divine in all men. And everybody has to come to the right understanding eventually. Eventually, however, does not mean in one little discussion with somebody. It can take quite a few incarnations to arrive at that eventually. And in the meantime, this simple thought that truth is goodness, as an example. The definition of goodness will be very different for a mafioso, let us say, and a St. Francis. To a mafioso, that which is good is, how much can I get out of that guy? He thinks of that as good. He doesn't think in terms of, well, it's sort of like a tiger. If a tiger were to lie in wait for you in an Indian jungle and grab you, it would be good for the tiger. It might not be all that good for you. The definition of good and evil is not such an easy one to arrive at. Philosophers have spent centuries batting it back and forth, but not the teachers of India. There are certain things that are understandable, but they can only be understood with the heart. Master gave the best definition that I have ever read. It was when he went to Japan. You remember in his book, The Autobiography of a Yogi, he took that trip to Japan, and it was sort of, he knew that God wanted him to go abroad, to teach abroad. He was sort of testing the waters of what it felt like by going to Japan. I guess he had a ticket there or something. And he didn't like the openness. He didn't feel they were open enough, and so he came back from there. But of course he knew where he'd have to go anyway. He'd had visions of this, of his destiny and so on. But the ideal of that he came back from there with was perfect. He said the entire motivation of human beings is simply twofold. One, to avoid suffering, and the other, to attain happiness. So simple it sounds almost childish. And yet, isn't that really what everybody is trying to do in one way or another? By that definition, a mafioso who doesn't know will think that he's escaping the suffering of poverty or the suffering of somebody else who's got a gun who's likely to shoot him and he wants to shoot him first, or one way or another he's trying to escape what he considers unhappiness. And on the other hand, he thinks he's going to, well, I talked to somebody who had a boyfriend who was sort of a crook, and he said it made him feel so powerful walking through the streets of New York with this gun in his pocket. And to him, that was happiness. Power, toughness, everybody being afraid of me. That's happiness. The trouble is, it isn't. You go a little bit further and you find that really your whole thought is fearful. I've got this gun, but is he behind my shoulders? Is he going to shoot me? There's fear. There's apprehension. There's menace. And people who don't find happiness in the right way, sooner or later, blow it. They know that they haven't got what they want. Howard Hughes was the wealthiest man in the world of his time. Just a week before his death, some journalist was able to interview him on the phone. And he said, well, have you found happiness? Nah, I can't say I'm happy. All the money in the world didn't give him what he wanted. He could have bought anything. That just made him more complex and more unhappy. I mean, what are you going to do when you have so much that you can buy and only one pocketbook out of which to pull it and one hand out of with which to take it? One house in which to put it. You can only eat one meal at a time. Money doesn't make you happy. Power doesn't make you happy. Human love doesn't make you happy. And in all of these, people think, well, I've got it made. But in the end, it's nothing really. The only thing that we all want is a kind of happiness that was defined by Shankaracharya. And so Master's definition of happiness was based on Sat Chidanandam. Ever-existing Master's translation of it was a little free. Ever-existing, ever-conscious, ever-new bliss. We want a joy that won't diminish. We want a joy that can't be destroyed. We want a joy that we're conscious of. It's not enough to sort of think, sort of abstractly, I'm happy. I remember this man, I had to be at a hearing for somebody, and there was somebody else being heard at the same hearing in a mental institution. And this man was obviously a complete slob. And the judge asked him, are you happy? And he said, I've never been so happy in my life. Well, you could see the guy was not happy. It was sort of, you might call, to invent a new adjective, slob-like happiness. It was not, there was not power in it. Powerful, conscious joy, that's what we want. To be not only happy in the sense of thinking, well, gosh, I'm not in the hospital, I don't have the flu, I'm not hungry, I guess, yeah, I'm happy. You don't need reasons to be happy. When there is this joy inside you that just sort of is there, and you're always singing with it inside, and that's conscious happiness. The other is just not being yet quite assured. That's not conscious happiness. So ever existing, nothing can ever take it away from you. Ever conscious, ever new. Because there are kinds of happiness that you sort of get, and then you have to keep reminding yourself that you're happy. You buy a car, and after, for a week you're happy. A week later you try to get your friends to say how happy you must be, and out of their envy you feel a certain perk. But by the end of a month, you pretty well, you no longer have that same sense of conscious, ever-new joy. Whereas the joy of God, the joy of the soul, is something that's always there. It's just sort of constantly bubbling in your heart. And you wake up in the morning, as Rajarshi used to say, I'd just wake up and turn over and just sort of float on this ocean of bliss. That's what we all really would like. And what keeps us from it? Many things. One of them is laziness. The sheer thought that, God, I don't know if I could stand being that happy. But you know, that's actually something somebody said to me not long ago. She said, I don't know that I want to advance spiritually. I don't know if I could take it. Well, but the thing is that every growth brings with it the power to take that growth. Every growth in understanding brings with it the power to accept and absorb that understanding. Every depth of happiness brings with it the power to live in that happiness. So that whereas, and this is a very common delusion, we've all had it, can I really face total bliss? Can I really face absolute consciousness? Can I really face being happy all the time? Can I at least go to sleep, for God's sake? But there is this fact that the saints have never complained about it. We never, as we study the lives of saints, see anybody or read of anybody who says, listen, forget it, I've had it, it's just not where it's at. They all are so convinced that it's the goal of life that they're perfectly willing to give up their lives to help other people to find it. It's something that's always new. You never get tired of it. This is what God consciousness is, and there's no pain at all. There's complete forgetfulness of pain in absorption in that joy. This is the goal of life. And if people don't seek it consciously, it's because they haven't yet overcome various delusions. One is that this thing which gives you misery is also pleasant, and so people cling to their misery. It's sort of like scratching a mosquito bite. It feels good, but it hurts at the same time. And the same thing with the pleasures and the satisfactions of this world. It's hard to give them up, because although we don't like them, although we'd like to get rid of them, at the same time, we're used to them. We kind of like them. We don't want to let them go, and so people cling to their delusions. This is what Thomas à Kempis writes in The Imitation of Christ, that because of these delusions being so much a part of our habit structure, it's difficult to let go of. Nonetheless, the goal of life is not knowledge as such, but wisdom, yes. And what is wisdom? The ability to have these fulfillments under all circumstances. St. Francis put it beautifully. You know that story from The Little Flowers of St. Francis? How he calls ahead to, I think it's Brother Leo, and talks about the nature of true joy. He says, Brother Leo, do you know what the nature of true joy is? And Brother Leo wants him to say, and so he says, well, if we, at the end of this long walk, arrive at the monastery, and the brother porter there, seeing us, closes the door in our faces. No, I'll put it the other way around as he did. I'm sorry, I got it wrong. Opens the door to us lovingly and welcomes us in. That isn't true joy. And if all our brother monks come and embrace us, that isn't true joy. And if they put us down and give us a big meal, that isn't true joy. And if after that they give us a warm bed and a comfortable place to sleep in and warm room, that isn't true joy. But you know what true joy is? And here's where most people get this story all wrong. Because he says, true joy is not just this, but he says true joy is if the porter, seeing us, slams the door in our faces, and if the other monks come out seeing that we're here and pick us up and throw us in a snowdrift and curse us and tell us to be gone. Now, most people stop there and say, that's true joy. Well, don't be ridiculous. Of course it's not true joy. But what St. Francis was saying is that if they can be treated that way, if life can treat you that way, if others can scorn you, contemn you, insult you, hurt you, try to destroy you, and if in spite of that you don't lose this joy, then you may know you have found that which is true joy. You see the difference? True joy is not what's given to you or what you receive from outside. It's something that you have inside that no outer condition can touch. Now this is wisdom, to be able to have that contact with divine joy, to such an extent that no matter what happens, as Master put it, to be able to stand unshaken amidst the crash of breaking worlds. To not worry about that tiger. I mean, if he wants to eat you, okay. You don't have to be afraid. To be able to know that no matter how people insult you, it's their problem, it's not yours. As a friend of mine likes to say, your opinion of me is not my business. And it's so. We have to be secure in ourselves and in the joy that we have in attunement with God. Now that's wisdom. Wisdom is not knowing things. I remember going to some school, it was in Dornat, by Rudolf Steiner, who was a great man, but he didn't have this knowledge. And all the people in that center there, their faces looked like parchment. It's very interesting, but people who think too much and don't have enough heart, their faces become completely withered, wizened. Whereas people who have heart quality, you can see it even in the quality of the skin, in so many things that show a kind of youth. One of the lovely things, if you haven't yet seen my slideshow, Different Worlds, it's really worth seeing, because it's photographs I took in different parts of the world. And it shows how it isn't the country, it isn't the nationality, it isn't the language you speak, it isn't the age you are. It's entirely what your attitude is. If you think too much about yourself, you can see it stamped in people's faces. And if you have joy in your heart because you serve other people and try to think of other people's well-being and not just your own, you see it in people's faces. And so I finish with a lot of faces, and most of them are from Ananda. Happy faces because they love to serve, but not only from Ananda. You can see that whatever people's beliefs are, if they give, there is radiance from within it. If they don't, there isn't. So wisdom is that. We don't reach wisdom by just thinking. What you need is like like a piano tuner who's always referring every note back to C, to Do. And no matter how far he goes up the scale, he knows that he has to keep referring it back to that anchor note. Otherwise, you get a D tuned just to the C, E tuned just to the D, and so on up the scale. By the time you've reached the end of several notes, you'll find, if you don't keep referring it back, that your ear won't have been able to hear the difference, but that upper note will be dissonant with the first note. It has to be that you keep checking back to that first note. We have to remember that we have an anchor note, and that anchor is the heart. It's not the mind. The mind can take pleasure, and boy, was the 20th century full of that kind of pleasure, of thinking that because they thought their way through to something, that they could come up with any preposterous philosophy and it would be true. Look at Jean-Paul Sartre, an absolutely fine example of absolute philosophical and intelligent stupidity. This man used all sorts of clever reasoning. Basically, okay, here's one line of reasoning. It ran through all his philosophy. He said that man is radically free from nature. Therefore, man is free. Well, what kind of reasoning is that? You have to say, is man free? But he didn't bother with that. He began with the premise that man is free. What makes us free? Try eating nails. Will you be able to get by with it? I don't think so. There are all kinds of things that tie you to nature and you can't get away from it. He wrote a book which he had the presumption, at least the man was audacious enough to say it, which made it a delight for me, in a sense, to absolutely explode his whole theory. Because when I wrote my book, which now is going to come out as Out of the Labyrinth, it was, I really did quite a study of him. Not that I liked it, but because it helped me to see how so many people in the world have been thinking that everything is matter. Consciousness is a product of matter. that moral values have no reality. It's just whatever you want to call a moral value. So Saint Genet, so-called, was a saint because he was absolutely true to his own criminal instincts. And the man was criminal. In fact, he was just about as bad as you can get. But he was completely, as he considered himself, self-integrated. Therefore, Sartre went so far as to call him a saint. Well, that's not a saint. There are certain rules that obtain for the entire human race. And the first question to ask Genet would be, have you escaped suffering and have you attained joy? The answer would inevitably be no. No to both. We need to have that anchor in the heart. And this is what I didn't like about Plato, this tendency to keep going out and out on a limb of reason without bringing you back to the first point, without bringing you back to what you are. I found that this is so in writing. Sometimes I'll get an absolutely delightful theory, and it doesn't come from the heart or from intuition, but it sounds so good. I think, well, let me pursue it and see what happens. And I find, bit by bit, that it just doesn't work. Now listen, it hurts. I mean, here I've got this beautiful thing worked out, but once I finally edit it to the point where it makes some sense, I realize it makes the wrong sense. So I have to throw it out and start again. But that doesn't happen very often, because usually when I write either words or music or whatever, everything I do, I offer it up and say, does my heart resonate with it? And I do feel, yes, this is right. And once that feeling is there, fine. But I always, even as a child, I used to have games sometimes, sort of trying to use reason trickily, knowing that it was false, not trying to fool other people that it was not false, just for the sheer fun of showing how you can use reason wrongly. I wanted everybody to know I was using it wrongly, that it was an absurd line of reasoning. But I also was helping myself to see that reason isn't going to give me truth. When it feels right, that's when it's right. And how do you know if it feels right? Well, there are two directions the heart's energy can go. One is upward, the other is downward. When it goes downward, it's emotion. And emotion is like somebody at a football game, and his team is going for that winning touchdown, and he's all excited and go win, 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 and he tries to feel as if his own shouting and willpower and everything's going to push that runner over the goal line and so on. Emotion is trying to make something happen, but not necessarily is it going to happen that way. Emotion is just a lot of noise. Calm feeling is very different from emotion. Emotion is wanting something to be so or not to be so. Intuition is knowing what it will be. A good example of that, because I've just been reading for an audio book, this book of mine, a place called Ananda, and in 2 days I did 3/4 of this book. Tomorrow I expect to finish it. And yes, it was hard work, which is why my heart's tired today, but it was very interesting. And then I remember when I was summoned from India to New York and thrown out of SRF. And I knew what was going to happen. I could feel it. I could feel the thoughts against me. And yet I refused to allow myself to believe it. Now that's the difference between intuitive knowledge and the emotions. The emotions rejected it. My entire life was dedicated to that way, is dedicated to that way, although I've had to define it differently, but the dedication has never changed. But I knew and I rejected. And this is what we have in our emotions. If the emotions are calm, then you can see whether a truth is really there or whether it's an untruth. Calm emotions, calm feeling is very different from emotion which wants or doesn't want, which likes or rejects. This is feeling, this is emotional feeling. Calm feeling, however, rises upward. Calm feeling, if it's true, is focused or directs its focus up to the point between the eyebrows. With this, you really don't go wrong. I've been amazed through the years to see how often, when I've tuned into that, it was right. You could have given me 1,000 reasons why it would be wrong, but it was right. It proved itself right. This you can have, you have. And I'm certain that every one of you, at one time or another at least, has had that experience of knowing whether a thing would be so and was so or not. But you have to keep referring your feelings, your actions, your decisions, everything back to the feeling in the heart. This sort of anchor note, you might say, as Master said in his book, autobiography, on the chapter on cosmic consciousness, I cognized the center of this empyrean as a point of intuitive perception in my own heart. Now it's curious in a way, because he said the ego is centered here in the medulla oblongata, but the center of intuitive understanding is here. Ramana Maharshi said that too. He said the center of real self is here. But that self has to be directed up through the ego to this point, to have a oneness there before you can really understand. So anytime you hear a teaching, always refer it back. Does it feel right? Don't accept other people's word for it. Does it feel right? Because if it does, then you can begin to understand. This is your center of real wisdom. It, it does need to be tied in with the heart, with the mind, with the intellect, but always, unless the heart agrees, don't trust the intellect. It's too capable of following a line of reasoning in many different directions. Things can make admirable sense and still be wrong. What was it that my friend Rod used to say? Devilishly ingenious, but damnably wrong. And so it is that we must get that sense of approval in the heart. Now, how do you have that sense? Well, there's a sense of recognition. I tell you, it won't come quickly. It isn't as if you're, after all, we've got to develop these things the way you have to develop your muscles. But bit by bit, you'll learn to recognize a certain feeling here in the heart that when it comes, it's right. And if it isn't there, be suspicious. Because you can have, everything can make perfect sense and still not work. And yes, with the intellect alone, you can put a man up on the moon. With the intellect alone, you can explode atoms. You can do all sorts of things. But even great scientists have referred back to the heart. Einstein said that. He said that real scientific discovery comes from a sense of mystical awe. Astonishing for somebody like him to make such a statement. But this sense of mystical recognition, this sense of, oh yes, this is so, this scientists have to have too, and lesser scientists don't have it. They're not to be put in the same category. But true scientists are very close to being like saints in the sense of this deep intuitive recognition of what is so. And you remember when Archimedes was taking his bath, and all of a sudden he got this discovery that came to his mind of the displacement of water and so on. You've all been through this in mathematics, and how he jumped out of his bath and went running down the street saying, "Eureka, Eureka, I've found it." Well, that's the feeling you get. So as you try to understand truth, don't try to figure it out. I went through that path. Fortunately, I also knew that this was important, but I remember just thinking. Without the heart, I couldn't have found. Thank God I wanted the heart too. Don't trust these long-winded philosophers who give you all sorts of reasons, and sort of like that line in Green Pastures, that beautiful movie. This young child in Sunday school after the Sunday school teacher is giving her this long quotation from the Bible, and so begat so-and-so, and he died, and so lived to be 800 years and begat so-and-so, and he died. And she says, I think it's just wonderful, Mr. Dishay. I can't understand a single word. Don't be bamboozled by people who can talk big words and give you they think deep thoughts because you can't understand a single word. Always ask your heart, does it make sense? Does my heart resonate with it? This is your guide. And if it does, you'll feel it. So, love God. Much more important than knowing God intellectually. You can't know Him except with the heart because God is love. You have to love Him to understand Him. And very often the simplest people are the ones who are closest to Him. And the parchment-faced professors are the ones who are the farthest from Him. Don't go to those books that give you lots of philosophy. Go to those simple books that talk of the heart, of the need of the heart for love and joy. Then you will know God.